Oh, that's lovely. You're on your way to Hollywood.
So for those who don't know, Matt is speaking in 2 other tracks this afternoon, so I will be kind of emceeing the afternoon. And so I can begin by introducing to you Grant Maxwell, who has served as an adjunct professor of English at Brooke College and Wheaton College in New York. His doctorate was from the City University of New York in English, and his dissertation was recently published as a book titled How Does It Feel? Rock and Roll in the Evolution of Worldviews.
Actually, the title is How Does It Feel? Elvis Presley, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, and the Philosophy of Rock and Roll.
That was a way better title than this one that seemed to have materialized on my paper. Was that the title of your dissertation before it became a book?
Yeah, it was sort of a working title.
It's still working.
Well, I'm glad you corrected me.
Oh.
He's also now a full-time editor of Archive, the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology.
Along with
myself. So we're really excited for that project. And today he will be speaking to us on a variety of general truths about the universe toward an integrative method. Help me welcome Grant.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to be participating in the revitalization of Archive. I think it's a really important aspect of the emerging discipline of archetypal cosmology, which, if any of you don't know, is based on Rick Tarnas's work and many other philosophers, from Whitehead and Jung to William James and Henri Bergson, many others. We'll be putting out a call for papers probably in the next, few weeks or a month. So I'd like to encourage all of you to submit. Could really use some some high quality submissions, and they don't necessarily have to be specifically about archetypal cosmology or the mandala of deities, which I thought was a really great summary of archetypal cosmology. They can be about the theoretical foundations of the discipline as well. So my talk is called A Variety of General Truths About the Universe, which is a quote from Process and Reality. And the subtitle, Toward an Integrative Method, I'm suggesting this term integrative method, but it could really be any number of terms, including ontological pluralism that Matt was talking about yesterday. I think that's very closely related to what I'm discussing. I think that the core idea is more important than what we call it. However, I do like the term integration because I think it directly answers the lexical force of Derridian deconstruction, which I see as still pretty central to contemporary academia, particularly the humanities. But call it whatever you want. Take it for what it's worth. Okay, so I will now read to you my paper. It has often been proposed that postmodernity might be described as a kind of interregnum between worldviews, clearing away and deconstruction of numerous modern assumptions that have rendered modernity, once the vanguard of the evolution of consciousness, now a dead end. As is usually the case, the mode of thought that was once so liberating and revolutionary has eventually settled into a static, constraining orthodoxy in the apparently inevitable onward march of successive cultural transformations. Yes?
As part of personal privilege,
yes.
Would you present your paper rather than read it so that I can catch on to your sense of the value of it?
I was gonna give a caveat before I talk,
Okay.
before I put into the paper, which is my preferred mode of philosophical communication is writing.
Okay.
So I'm gonna
you can fake it.
I'm gonna start by reading and probably loosen up as I go along. Yeah.
I would really love
Thanks
to
for
hear
that.
I want to hear what you're saying.
That urgent. Right. Okay. So although the privileging of reductionist materialism in the wake of Descartes and Newton was immensely liberating, allowing rational intellect to be individuated from the relatively undifferentiated relational modes characteristic of pre-modernity, this process of individuation appears to be nearing its end. Thus, it seems clear that the inadequate assumptions dogmatically assumed in modernity, as Whitehead puts it, must be set aside in order for a new and more profound set of premises to emerge. As most of the participants in this track might agree, just such a novel worldview has been emerging with increasing insistence over the last few centuries, with Whitehead a primary exemplar of a diverse movement stretching from 19th century thinkers like Hegel and John Stuart Mill through William James, Carl Jung, Bergson, and many, many others, that seeks to move beyond a mere rejection of the modern in favor of a more participatory, vital, and integrative mode of cognizance. In seeking a coherent explanation for the way processes change over time, perhaps the most general possible description for many areas of human inquiry, this perspective emphasizes the reconciliation of seemingly incommensurable oppositions for the production of emergent wholes, which appear to trace an increasingly expansive temporal trajectory through successive phases of potentialities ingression in many domains across scale. And that last sentence is sort of a summary of my current book, but the part I'm going to be focusing on in this paper is the reconciliation of opposites. Although critiques of modernity have been and will continue to be vitally productive, I would argue that the most effective way to address the pressing issues of late modernity is not through critique alone, which seems to me the essence of the postmodern mode, but through the savvy promulgation of a mode of thought in which such critiques become readily apparent. In this view, the simple critical negation of fallacious premises can never result in the overcoming of the problems that result from those premises. Rather, it seems that only an emergent stage of awareness can produce such a fundamental transformation as required by the current ecological, economic, and political crises. This is not to say that frustration and anger are not valid and even necessary responses to the destruction of the environment and the economically and politically impelled suffering of human beings. But I would suggest that a solution will arise not only or even primarily from protesting such vast injustices, but from the positive emergence of a more integrative mode of relation. For the still predominant view of the world that reifies a radical separation of subject and object, the supposition that we should collectively care for the health of our planet, though an eminently rational consideration, appears not to be an urgent concern for the majority of people. Although many of us have a more or less firm sense that something should be done about technological obstacles, often seem dauntingly immovable. But the consensus reality of the mainstreams of Western culture in the second decade of the 21st century is still primarily rationalist, reductionist, and materialist, even though many of us maintain vociferous opinions about this issue. Let me do that sentence again. Okay. Because the consensus reality of the mainstreams of Western culture in the second decade of the 21st century is still primarily rationalist, reductionist, and materialist, even though many of us maintain vociferous opinions about this issue, the collective organism of our culture appears simply to be incapable of caring for what it constructs as the objective, non-human world sufficiently to generate the will to meet these hurdles. However, if enough individuals in our culture are able to overcome the constructed Cartesian division between mind and world to enter into the more expansive worldview we seem to be collectively articulating in this track, this slightest change of tone, to borrow Whitehead's phrase, would yet make all the difference, and the tipping point would most likely be reached when the emergent entity of our culture would also make the shift to the novel mode. If this transition was to occur on a mass scale, I would argue, the political, economic, and technological factors would probably align with relative suddenness to produce the solutions that we know are possible, because the will to act would suddenly be evident. Thus, I would contend that it is not modernity's fault that it cannot bring itself genuinely to take responsibility for the environment, as the privileging of human mentality over nature lies at the very root of the modern worldview. However, The emerging worldview and its re-embrace of pre-modern epistemologies and modes of causation, in addition to modern ones, cannot help but feel compelled to care for the earth from which it emerged and in which it embedded, just as one feels compelled to care for one's family or for one's own body. Thus, the very limitations of the modern worldview, I think, appear to be leading us inexorably toward the overcoming of those limitations in an essentially dialectical process. Okay. Although there has been a great deal of ink spilled about the possibility of reconciling disparate epistemologies over the last few centuries, the clearest and most direct expression of what might term an integrative method is, to my mind, articulated by John Stuart Mill in his essay on Coleridge. And he writes in a passage that I first encountered in Rick Thomas's work: all students of man and society who possess that first requisite for so difficult a study, the due sense of its difficulties, are aware that the besetting danger is not so much of embracing falsehood for truth as of mistaking part of the truth for the whole. It might be plausibly maintained that in almost every one of the leading controversies, past or present, in social philosophy, both sides were right in what they affirmed, or wrong in what they denied, and that if either could have been made to take the other's view in addition to its own, little more would have been needed to make its doctrine correct. I'd like to suggest that this dictum, that opposing sides of controversies are right in what they affirm, they're wrong in what they deny, can be applied universally and systematically to many diverse modes of thought. Whitehead seems to concur with Mill in Processing Reality when he writes, in its turn, every philosophy will suffer a deposition, but the bundle of philosophic systems expresses a variety of general truths about the universe, awaiting coordination and assignment of their various spheres of validity. Such progress and coordination is provided by the advance of philosophy, and in this sense, philosophy has advanced from Plato onward. Carried to its logical conclusion, this simple but profound method calls us radically to affirm the positive content of every possible way of understanding the world, no matter how distant from our personal inclinations, our individual way of just seeing and feeling the total push and pressure of the cosmos, as William James put it. For instance, in attempting to adjudicate between the belief that the world is composed of purposeless material and the belief that the world is filled with intrinsic meanings and purposes, an integrative method might allow us to recognize that both of these suppositions contain partial truths valid within their appropriate domains of applicability. If one is constructing a building, for example, the materialist quantitative mode is indispensable, for if the construction is not based on sound measurements and solid physical principles, the building will collapse. However, if one wishes to understand the purpose of the building, the human activities that will take place inside, and the aesthetic considerations that condition the affective tone for that activity, then one is in a realm of cognizance that exceeds the explanatory scope of physical science. Even if one believes that the emergence of human consciousness out of animality can be explained by the mere collision of atoms, this belief does not logically preclude a complementary belief that there is a teleological impulse toward novelty endemic to the fabric of the cosmos, which Whitehead asserts when he says the essence of life is the teleological introduction of novelty. This dialectical synthesis subsumes the polarity through a developmental process, and I'm assuming a coherence between Jamesian pragmatism, the Hegelian dialectic, Whiteheadian thought that might be controversial, but I'm not really. I'm not going to try and prove that that's the case right now. I'm actually in the initial processes of working on a book to try and argue that. And actually, James specifically really didn't like Hegel very much, and he I think it was in a pluralistic universe, wrote an essay just tearing Hegel to shreds. However, this is sort of a side point. John Dewey said something to the effect of, after reading James's Principles of Psychology, he thought that James had more in common with Hegel than he'd like to admit. And I think that's true.
There's a comment too that James made did nitrous for the first time. I finally understand what Hegel's talking about.
Yes. Yeah, Hegelian mysticism. Okay. So this dialectical synthesis subsumes the polarity through a developmental process, absorbing what each point of view asserts and jettisoning what each point of view denies, producing a novel perspective in which materialism and idealism, for instance, are both useful tools in the conceptual armamentarium, special cases of a larger reality, in a fractal reiteration of the relationship between relativity and quantum mechanics, which can be considered partial aspects of a more comprehensive and yet undiscovered scientific theory. This novel mode might affirm the complementarity of quality and quantity, of formal and final causation, in addition to the material and efficient causation privileged in modernity, while putting aside as historical contingency the negative assertions of pre-modernity, including static hierarchy, which is the denial of human equality, fatalism, which is the denial of free will, and physical geocentrism, which is the denial of heliocentrism, as well as putting aside the negative assertions of modernity, including reductionist materialism, which is the denial of forms and purposes, exclusively quantitative temporality, which is the denial of qualitative duration, otherwise known as synchronicity, and exclusively static temporality, which is the denial of teleology. By their very nature, revolutions in thought define themselves against the mode that preceded them. On a large scale, the privileging of rationality and reductionist materialism in modernity has defined itself in relation to the often, not always, naive lack of differentiation between intellect and affect in pre-modernity. And when I say modernity, I mean the mode of thought that emerged in the axial age and became predominant around the 17th century. Similarly, whereas teleology was a predominant causal mode in pre-modernity, modernity has often defined itself by a rejection of teleology, particularly in the form of apocalyptic Christianity in the West. It seems to me that this emerging mode appears to be expressing in different valences. What did I say? It seems to me that the emerging mode we all seem to be expressing in different valences does in fact define itself in relation to the mode that precedes it, postmodern. However, I would argue that to a greater degree than the previously predominant modes of thought, the novel mode appears to subsume the previous worldviews in an emergent synthesis that transcends and includes all of these antecedents. This incipient mode shares with the postmodern a recognition of the radically constructed quality of lived reality and acknowledges the validity of the predominant postmodern interpretation of this fact as indicating that if there is no fixed transcendent truth, then the world is void of intrinsic meaning. However, in a paradoxical operation, which I see as characteristic of the recursive complexity of this emerging mode, this deconstructive interpretation of the world is simultaneously recognized as pragmatically plausible, but contradicted by the new mode's affective attitude, which I think affirms all points of view and only denies the validity of those elements of developmentally previous worldviews, which in their turn deny the positive beliefs affirmed by other modes of cognizance. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll get it.
Okay, cool. This emerging mode can thus be described as affirming the validity of all positive beliefs, and even as affirming the temporary historical necessity of the negative denial of those beliefs for the forging of novelty, which Hegel described as carrying with the negative. But this mode of thought appears above all to seek reconciliation of apparently irreconcilable epistemologies by discovering the inevitable partial truths in each party to any controversy, whether in the debate between political conservatism and progressivism, or in the perhaps more fundamental opposition between religion and science. I was forced to kind of I don't know how many of you have spent time with or maybe some of you are political conservatives. I kind of doubt it, but I spent a year in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, which is a very conservative place, and I never really spent a lot of time engaging with conservative people, and it just struck me that I had this caricature in my mind of what conservatives believed, and then in fact there are many different kinds of conservatives, and they actually, have a few cogent points, which we can maybe discuss later.
Are you saying they're people?
Yes, occasionally.
Sometimes.
When they're not bad, actually.
Mostly.
So by refusing to succumb to the seductive ease of defining oneself in relation to what one is against, including the paradoxical act of defining oneself against being against anything at all, this mode of thought seems to hold the tension between apparently incommensurable oppositions to allow a novel entity, the reconciling third, as Jung puts it, to emerge. In this view, one is not faced with a genuine controversy unless both parties to the disagreement have legitimate claims to some aspects of a larger reality. Let's see. We only have 2 days.
Great.
Good.
Okay. I timed it. It was almost exactly 20 minutes. So it seems to be a nice length for a talk. So it seems that the emergence of rational thought on a wide scale in modernity is fractally reiterated by the current novel mode's emergence, which employs intellectual rationality and affective, intuitive, epiphanic epistemologies in a higher order confluent synthesis. And each successive synthesis appears to constitute a temporal compaction, as the dialectical reconciliation of intellect and intuition is a more pragmatically effective way to approach experience than intellect alone, so that the insoluble issues for pure mentality, such as the mind-body problem, can be resolved by the emergent attention of intellect to bodily knowledge. Of course, new, deeper kinds of challenges emerge with the novel mode that are perhaps not even expressible in a coherent way by exclusivist mentality. For instance, the question of how to assist those who feel themselves to be constrained by the hegemony of pure reason in making the leap into the emerging processual worldview is a difficult one to tackle, qualitatively echoing the struggle of the mental mode to offer rationality to those who begin to experience their mythical, pre-rational worldview as limiting without ineffectively imposing modern values on pre-modern cultures. As witnessed in the still prominent debates between positivist science and religious fundamentalism in American culture, it is generally not possible to convince someone who believes in the literal truth of mythical disclosure through reasoned argumentation, as the pre-modern mythical mode doesn't particularly value reason. Rather, the most successful strategy appears to be to articulate rationality in an attractive or even seductive way, forging texts, which is my preferred mode of transmission, or institutions for use by those on the cusp of transition from one mode to another. And this strategy can apparently be re-employed in the enticingly inclusive and aesthetically deft texts and communities that propound the emerging orientation. Thus, rather than reject materialism in favor of some form of anti-materialist idealism, it is perhaps more productive to assert a mode of thought that finds values in epistemologies premised on both material and efficient causation on one hand, and formal and final causation on the other, and perhaps other modes of causation that don't fit under that Aristotelian schema. So, whereas for modernity, the mind-body problem, climate change, the acidification of the oceans, political gridlock, economic stratification, and many other issues appear intractable, the qualitative experience of the emerging mode may generally be more optimistic about these problems, because it appears to possess both the conceptual and affective tools necessary to solve them that modernity does not on a collective scale. Not only the rational and technological abilities to engineer solutions developed by mentality, but the implicit compassion and sense of responsibility for the other, whether human or non-human, that is fundamentally lacking at large for the modern worldview, if not always for the modern individual, based on the unsustainable Cartesian dualism. It's my contention that the most efficacious way to assist in the widespread emergence of the novel mode, which may have the capacity to resolve these urgent issues, is to apply consistently and pervasively this integrative method, articulated in various ways and various valences by some of our greatest thinkers. To that end, the question we might constantly ask ourselves is thus, perhaps, not primarily what is wrong with any mode of thought, but what is right about it. However, putting this maxim directly into practice, I would affirm that the critical mode itself, which Whitehead describes as the peak of mentality, is an essential element for discerning precisely what parts of a mode's content are positive, and thus apparently complementary with all other positive assertions. Postmodernism has allowed the predominant intellectual culture in the West to begin to see that its fundamental ideas about the world and about our identities in the world, which seemed fixed and immutable, from essentialized gender roles, sexual identities, and racial characteristics, to Cartesian dualism, monocausality, and quantitative temporality, are far more malleable than we had previously imagined, as we gain unprecedented access to other cultures and other ways of thinking within our cultures. So I want to honor that postmodern insight. But I think that insight into the radically constructive quality of reality is possibly in the process of being turned on its head in the novel insight that all modes of thought have value insofar as they do not impinge on other modes, and that in fact all modes are necessary for the construction of an intelligible and comprehensive worldview. Thanks for putting up with my reading.
Good.
So yeah, you have about 15 minutes for discussion.
I love this. Like I was telling a couple people in here, I'm really excited to respond to all these things I'm speaking tomorrow, because I'm also going to be working with these tensions of the, how to reconcile or not reconcile. What I'm curious about is how you see this. How do you practically engage with this? Like, how do you take this to your life right now?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we do this as a society practically?
Yeah, I think this really goes back to what Jonathan was talking about in his talk earlier, which is try to experience each moment in a prayerful way, and try to be present in each moment and bring attention to that. Attention to the thought of reality of lived experience, which we can't always achieve. But I think instead of reacting in an egoic way to something that's felt as invasive or difficult, I personally find it helpful to stand back and think, what's this person's underlying motivation? What do they think they're doing? Why do they think this is a good idea for them to be doing something that I find objectionable? So, and it's, of course, it's not always an easy thing to do.
Well, like how I've spent time with conservatives too.
Yeah.
And I just, like, how do you bridge that gap with someone who is convinced of the right position and not open to that self-reflection or that reflection?
What I found with conservatives more than their views to be difficult was their performative mode. Because before I moved to Gatlinburg, I was living in New York City, which is very, 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 it's very fast and very hyper neurotic, which I enjoy. And then I moved to, it's one of the, the slowest places in the world. There's a strip filled with Bible stores and Christmas stores and putt-putt golf and helicopter rides and things like that. And so I would go into convenience stores and I would talk to someone, and it seemed like they would think I was crazy because I was talking quickly and trying to be excited and friendly. And what I realized is that that culture is very tribal, and you're either in or you're out. And the way that you demonstrate that you're in this culture is by being it's almost meditative, really, except it's completely opposite worldview from the meditative world. But it's a mythical worldview. We all believe in the same thing. We believe in Jesus and America and guns and big cars, and it's very slow and very considered. It's actually very attentive, and it's very focused on collective experience rather than you don't find a lot of the people who are in their heads in conservative enclaves tend to be sort of the kind of the goth kids on the outskirts, or the Wicca kids, having their ceremonies down at the river or whatever. So it's these are the my wife grew up there. These are the people that she was friends with.
Right.
The predominant culture there, it's very homogenous, and if you're in, you're in. And I think someone was saying that about PCC. It's almost like the mirror. It's like the negative doppelganger of PCC. Because it's polar opposite in terms of worldview, in terms of beliefs and aspirations. But in that sense, I think those two things are closer to each other in a way than sort of hyper rationalist postmodern academia notes. Yeah.
Brantford, because I'm in South Carolina in the summer, so we'll just all.
Great.
But when I'm in South Carolina, and I go every summer, and in the beginning, it was like the biggest culture shock in the world. I mean, not like a foreign country, but more than that. Okay, and I kept trying to remember this quotation that you quote for years. I guess I probably read it in Rick's book. How does that go? Right in what they affirm, but wrong in what they deny?
Yeah.
Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay, because that would come to mind, the critiques, that go on in both directions, obviously. But first of all, I would like, let me think now exactly, what you said earlier, and your comment about how you feel when you walk into this environment and suddenly you're in this other culture, so to speak. Okay, when you were saying in the more theoretical part of it earlier, that the ability to see what's right in the worldview, the ability to see what's of value in the worldview, that applies here. And also, having had that experience you described in South Carolina, and wonderful people, we all agree with that. They're the bad guys we could find anywhere, but...
and you probably don't want to talk to them about controversial topics.
No, but also, like when you were saying, when you go into a store and you see these things on there, there's something it does importantly for us, which is it shows us what we need.
Right.
And it's like, this isn't what I need, Look what's on the shelves, or look at these. In a certain way, it becomes something like a practice.
Right.
To expand, and then as I had been there enough, now I'm in Montana and ranching country, and which is a different kind. Were you the one that said there are all the different kinds of conservatives? Or did someone else say that? Yeah, it's a different kind of conservatism. But it's so easy, just in quick passing through, to see all those things that we come up against as harsh difficulties. But, to take in intellectually. But after time, you begin to see these other things that we haven't particularly put into our worldview, or we don't maybe need. let's say, these people in Montana, for example, they know nature like crazy.
Right.
And they know, who was mentioning the wave, the fact that there's a wave language. It was in the end of Jonathan's talk. It made me think of them because they see, they're seeing how the seasons go and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's looking at the good things that come out of that. I'm just saying that is a valuable thing. Then we're also always going to bump into the other side too. But I think it's a very important point that you make, and I'm so glad you took. Was it Mill or is it Tarnas? Who made the statement?
Oh, no, John Stewart.
I hadn't realized that.
His
Okay.
SAM quoted.
But I think that's very, very important when we're talking about worldviews.
Mhm.
We see them as blocks, and we have these conflicting worldviews. But if they can be seen and meshed in a different way.
They're intimately imbricated
Yeah.
because in a sense, the thing that we're trying to articulate is it's the dialectical other to I think contemporary conservatism and sort of the PCC-esque mode of thought are both dialectical others to exclusively rationalist modernity. But I think one is the conservative mode is a regression, a yearning for earlier certainties, and our mode is obviously it's trying to get on to the next mode. And I think what you're saying is really important, that we have to deeply engage with the other in order to. That's right. It's a spiritual practice to go to the places that are most difficult for us and that are most frightening.
And just a last thing, so Josefina can go here, but the other thing is, for example, it isn't necessarily that they want to go back, it's that they are still back there. And ironic, back in that way, back in that fabric.
But they choose to be there because they have Jon Stewart on the TV, just like anyone else. They choose. They actively. Bob Dylan calls it a passion for dumbness. He said that where he grew up, it is. But I think what he meant by dumbness is it's not necessarily stupidity. Because he's talking about the Midwest where he comes from, but they have a passion for dumbness. And what I think he means is the inability to speak. It's people, if you use big words in a conservative community, people look at you like you're crazy. It's all about the rhythms of speech, and it's about there's just this incredible focus on how it feels, on how a glance feels, or the turning of the body, or the rhythms of the southern drawl, or I'm sure the Montana drawl, or any kind of drawl. So I think that's I found it really important to immerse myself in that because it was something I didn't grow up with. I grew up in Northern California in Mill Valley, and then I lived in various places where I lived in New York for many years, and it was something that I found very, very challenging. But I was also I felt teleologically drawn to. I wanted that thing because I wanted to be transformed by it. Yeah.
Do you guys really prefer the
I was just letting them.
I was kind of focused on that exactly, on that idea of the partial truth, and how, and I wanted to connect it with what Aaron has been talking about, compassion. I think that in a certain way, it is I hope a compassionate act from the person that's talking to us, or our compassionate act for us who's talking to somebody else, to try to search for that partial truth in the other, so we can approach the other from their partial truth and create a channel of communication. So I like that idea of I think it's a very important idea to have in ourselves when we are engaging with other people, especially these other many types of conservatives, people that we find around you, from and deal with all the time. And also being, the idea of measuring our body language and our language itself, because as you say, we start talking PCC, abstract language, somebody will go someplace, and we're not in the media where somebody can understand us, then we're going to scare, we put the divide. We lose them and we put the divide.
Yeah. I agree. You have to modulate your language and your performative sort of affective attitude for your audience.
And listen to them.
And the respect of it, and the respect that comes from the idea that there is a partial truth coming from the other side, that it's interesting for you to bring in.
Yeah, I can learn something from anyone.
It's really interesting to think about conservatives. I mean, I was raised in a conservative household in Connecticut.
Okay.
There were still, like, when Connecticut was really a purple state. I mean, it is somewhat now, but it's very different.
It's fiscally conservative.
I mean, Rockefeller Republicans, who believed in small government, fiscal conservatism, privacy was a platform plank for the Conservative Party. And something that's very interesting to me, those days are gone. I mean, if you look back to, let's say, even during the Reagan era, like the votes on particular issues in Congress would always be split, even intra-party, right? I mean, there would be a significant portion of each party voting for specific legislation, such that deals were always possible for legislation. And it tilted towards Republican if we had a Republican president, and it tilted towards Democrat. But there was still big legislation that would happen that was not necessarily part of the platform. So this is something that's, I just want to tease this out for 1 second. It's interesting to me that the people now, there's been this appropriation of conservatism by the money, which is situated in the cities, and the people that self-identify as conservative, very often are members of rural communities who are in touch with the land, as you said, to some degree, right? But they're not experiencing, or maybe they're not, maybe I'm projecting here, potentially. They're not experiencing the sort of vanguard to the same degree as, say, urban dwellers, right?
That's a major point.
Yeah, of what climate change is doing necessarily, of what, and I think it's very interesting because our problems must seem very far away to some of these communities, and yet I look at someone like a Mitt Romney, and here's a guy who, in the Mormon tradition, they have food banks. Like, he has a structure within his church to basically care for the other, that he is responsible for, like as a bishop in his church, when he was that not everybody is a member of the Mormon church, and that some people, all they've got is government. And
I totally see what you're saying. I don't want to take away from Josephine's time, but let me just say this, just to put a capstone on it. I think that you're right that things have become much more polarized, and I think that things tend to become more polarized before synthesis. So I think that people lament this intense polarization of the conservative, but I think it's actually an indication that we're approaching a movement of reconciliation.
I agree.